Finally, Jesus saw the chance to grab some time for himself to grieve the death of his friend and mentor, John the Baptist. He had been moving in that direction earlier during the day when he experienced a sudden change of plans as a crowd of more than 5,000 people, desperate for healing, appealed to his sense of compassion. So after a full day of miraculous cures, and after managing to feed everyone with just a few fishes and some loaves of bread, he sent them on their way. Now as evening drew near, and after having instructed his disciples to go ahead in a boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus was looking forward to some mountaintop solitude where he would finally be able to do some grief work. It's only about 7 miles from one side of the sea to the other. And because the disciples were experienced fishermen, it shouldn't have taken long to get to the other side. But the Sea of Galilee is known for its violent storms that can pop up without any notice. And as luck would have it, that's just what happened on that particular evening. Throughout the night, high waves endlessly battered the boat, and gale-force winds prevented them from getting to safe harbor. And if that wasn't enough, just as the nighttime sky began to give way to the morning, even while the storm continued to hammer away at them, they noticed in the distance what could only be described as a ghost. It had to be a ghost because human beings don't walk on water. And to make matters even worse, the ghost was making its way in their direction. And any courage they had mustered to battle the storm was stripped away from them with the approach of this nighttime phantom, a sight sufficient to reduce these tough and robust fishermen to nothing more than a litter of howling and sniveling puppies. That is, until they recognized the voice of the ghost calling out to them. It was Jesus telling them to calm down because it was him and not a ghost, after all. Jesus calling out to them to take heart and have courage. But here's the curious part of the story. I would have told Jesus to get himself in the boat right now and quit fooling around. But not Peter. Peter was a different sort of person than I. Peter asked for an invitation from Jesus to join Jesus out in the middle of the wind and the whitecaps, to which Jesus replied, "Yes, come on and join me." And Peter did. Not sure of the outcome, a very vulnerable Peter stepped out into the confusion and chaos of the stormy sea. Peter resisted fear. He saw where he needed to be, in this case beside Jesus, and he took the necessary measures to get there. Peter stood up against the howling storm that battered the boat and the crew. Yesterday, the governor of Virginia declared a state of emergency in Charlottesville as white nationalists clashed with counter-protesters for the second day in a row over a plan to remove the statue of a Confederate general from the city park. The turmoil began with a march Friday night and chants of blood and soil, which broke out just after 9 p.m. The German-originated expression popularized in Nazi era refers to an ideology of ethnic purity based on blood descent and territory. Things escalated Saturday morning as hundreds of white nationalists gathered, waving Confederate flags, chanting even more Nazi-era slogans, wearing helmets and carrying shields. They converged on a statue of Robert E. Lee in the city's Emancipation Park and began chanting phrases like, "You will not replace us," and "Jew will not replace us." Hundreds of counter-protesters quickly surrounded the crowd, chanting and carrying their own signs. By 11 a.m. yesterday, the scene had exploded into taunting, shoving, and outright brawling. The police cleared the area before noon, and the Virginia National Guard arrived as officers began arresting some who remained for unlawful assembly. A couple of hours later, a car plowed into a crowd of counter-protesters, and a hospital official said at least 19 people were injured. The fight was the latest in a series of tense dramas that have been unfolding across the United States. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump to take our country back, David Duke, a former imperial wizard of Ku Klux Klan, told reporters yesterday. Dear friends, there is a storm that is sweeping across our country, just as terrible as the storm that threatened to swamp the boat carrying the disciples in this morning's text. For some of us, for those of us who enjoy white privilege, and I am one of them, it seems to have popped up overnight, but it hasn't. It's been brewing for quite some time, ever since the founding of this nation centuries ago. But if you look into the gloom, even as the new day dawns, if we squint our eyes into the darkness, we can just make out the figure of Jesus walking toward us and telling us to take heart and not to be afraid. You see, Jesus doesn't just reside within the safety of church sanctuary walls. You are much more likely to find him in the middle of the storm. And from the storm, he calls us to join him in the eye of the storm. Like Peter, we soon learn that we're not very good at this. And there will be times when we find ourselves distracted and we will end up going under. But God has never called us to success, only to obedience. The obedience to which I am called is one which resists oppression, whether it takes the form of racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, or religious violence and bigotry. It's a scary place to be, this storm against which I stand. I would much rather stay within the safety of the ship, otherwise known as the four walls of this church. But it's a false safety, because the ship will sink if we continue to cling to it as our refuge. God is our refuge. And I cannot call myself a Christian or a follower of the way of Christ unless I follow the resistance that calls out the evil that has bubbled to the surface in Charlottesville and which is simmering in every nook and cranny of this country. I would like to know that you are with me in this. I want to believe that you abhor the evil that is personified in mobs that shout blood and soil. So I invite you to join me in a litany for Charlottesville written by Fran Pratt, the creative director of worship at the Austin Vineyard Church. On our website, Pratt reminds us that when things happen and we don't know what to pray, when circumstances arise, tragedies occur, and we find ourselves either at a loss for words or overwhelmed by our own emotions, that's when it's helpful to have a prayer to pray. Litanies affirm we are on the journey, living out the story of redemption and resurrection, receiving together the grace and perspective that comes from focusing on Jesus' story. And together we can pray words that help us understand the gospel and reimagine our lives in light of it. So Rachel, go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. God, we are sad to see the stark truth of what remains among us: hatred, bigotry, and racism. We are sad to see flagrant parades of violence in our streets, flaunting prejudice and intolerance. We mourn with our sisters and brothers who are harmed in body and soul by these exhibitions. Indeed, we are all harmed. They are us and we are them. We say no. This can go no further. We reproach these misguided souls resolutely and lovingly. Help us not to bury our heads or resist the lesson before us of the truth of the darkness that exists in our midst, growing like weeds among wheat. Help us to stamp out hate by love and love alone. Help us to preach peace on loudspeakers and pedestals, but also in quiet relationships, in art and poetry, in song and dance, in bread and wine, in words written and spoken, in pulpits and in alleys, in boardrooms and porches. Sneaky peace, overt peace, back roads peace, front door peace. The way of Christ is peace. The method of Christ is love. The means of Christ is invitation. The ends of Christ are unity. The way of Christ is the way we follow. Amen and amen.